Hello, my name is Selena, and I am the host of Evangelinguistics, a channel dedicated to ESL, writing, reading, and study skills concepts, all from a biblical perspective. In today's lesson, we are going to be talking about creating study guides, which is one of my favorite topics because creating a study guide is so helpful in many ways, which we will get into next. And so, why should I create a study guide is a great question. So, here we have a list of reasons why to create a study guide. Of course, you want to prepare for assessments like quizzes, exams, and finals, especially if your professor didn't give you a study guide. However, there are other reasons. For example, study guides allow you to see connections or common themes between course material. They help you understand the course objectives and the reason why a course exists. They help you improve your organizational skills as you're putting everything together. And when I mean everything, I don't mean all information that you learn in the course, just the most important information, which we'll get into later. They also allow you to take an active role in your study habits by actively putting things together. And as you're doing that, you're implicitly and explicitly learning intaking material. So this is really, really great. So let's look at what study guides are not and what they are. So study guides are not essays, meaning you can use bullet points. You don't have to be so formal or structured because you're not giving a study guide to your professor, you're not submitting it, you're using it for your personal reference to prepare for a formal exam. So study guides are similar to essay outlines because of how they're formatted. So if you love outlining, study guides is definitely for you. So they are also not filled with non-essential minor details because they are main idea oriented. And then lastly, study guides are not boring. They should be creative. So you have to learn certain material, but you can control how that material is organized in your study guide. You could also use pictures in your study guide as well as audio files or links to videos that help you to further understand and reinforce course concepts if that is helpful for you. And so let's move on to look at this topic. So first we're going to talk about what type of content can go into the study guide, like your course material and key terms, main ideas. And then we'll look at a helpful tool such as Google Docs and table of contents to help you navigate through your study guide efficiently. Here is a helpful slide on some of the things that you want to include in your guide. So first you want to include the course objectives. So in other words, these are the week objectives or learning goals of your course. So especially if you're using Canvas as a learning system for your school. Typically, your professors will organize course or week objectives into modules. So like module 1 could be week 1 where you'll find week 1 objectives. And so you definitely want to think about that because your course objectives drive the purpose of the course as well as the types of content you'll be encountering, such as your class readings. So class readings like book chapters are really important, including your own summaries and annotations you want to include in the study guide. You also want to think about class notes, so like your professor's lecture slides, as well as personal notes in your journal, as well as class assignments. So class assignments like homework and quizzes are very important. I wish I knew this when I was in K through 12, that a teacher's feedback is really important because it helps you to identify what you did wrong on homework and what you did wrong on a quiz. So typically, each assessment is supposed to prepare you for the bigger assessment, which is like a final or a test or an essay. And so you want to pay attention to the feedback and apply it diligently as you are studying your course material. And so I want to kind of go more into detail in terms of the course objective. So this is a great example that you might find in your Canvas module. So during week 5, you'll be able to accomplish the following: define morphemes, discuss structural analysis and its importance in helping students decode multi-syllabic words, and identify 2 structural analysis strategies you would use in the classroom. And so we'll see how this plays out in the study guide when we go to the application portion of our video. And so let's move on to finding key terms and main ideas. So key terms in a text are often noticeable because they're repeated constantly. You also want to be on the lookout for more explicit forms of key terms, especially when they're formatted differently, like if they're bolded or in italics. You also want to ask yourself which terms are being defined. So sometimes textbook authors are nice enough to define the terms and to bold them so you know exactly what to study for the test. And then lastly, this kind of ties into the repeated criteria, but oftentimes key terms that are repeated are important for the comprehension of the text. Let's look at how to identify main ideas this time. Main ideas in a text, you want to pay attention to common themes. So find common themes between your sources. Ask yourself, what are things that each source talks about? You also want to find common themes between keyword definitions. So look at your keyword definitions and ask, do most definitions have or hold a common idea? Most likely, that idea is a main idea. You can also create a summary with all of your key terms and then read the result to find the main idea or ideas. Let's move on to our Google Docs. So essentially, this is my Google Docs, and I have 3 different templates. So typically, how you organize your study guide really depends on who you are, how you learn, but also the type of test or exam you're preparing for. So for example, if your test is going to assess you on main ideas and how they're connected, then it makes sense to organize your study guide that way. You might have a test where your professor will use that test to assess you on how well you know a chapter or how well you know an overall book. And so in that case, you want to organize your study guide according to chapters rather than main ideas. And so let's look at this example where we have main ideas. So essentially, you have main idea number 1, and then underneath that, key terms and their definitions, as well as a summary that you can use to help you really understand how the key terms relate to each other. And the summary reinforces that main idea as well. So you could do the same thing with main idea number 2, main idea number 3, and so on and so forth. So scrolling down, we have this type of study guide organized in chapters. So if my professor wanted me to understand the importance of C.S. Lewis's work, Screwtape Letters, and we're being assessed on the chapters, then I would include each chapter or the chapters that were assigned. If I want to put more details, then I can, and then again, a summary or conclusion. And then I would do the same thing for subsequent chapters as well. Here we have a third way of organizing a study guide, which is basically question and answer. So here I have a main question and I could just write down the answer. So this is really helpful, especially if questions help you to have a goal for reading. So if you have a question, your goal is to find the answer. And so that makes you more diligent in researching, so improving your researching skills and your study skills at the same time, which is a win-win. You can also take questions that your professor has given you and then break them down into several sub-questions if that is helpful to answer that way. Let's move on. Here we have my sample study guide, which is organized around main ideas, which I personally learned from my school's reading program. So essentially the main idea, the first one we have is structural analysis is essential to core phonics instruction. And so here we have my key terms, so some of which directly tie and back to those course objectives, which I could go back to right here. And so here we have defined morphemes and discuss structural analysis, which we are doing here in this section. And so in my summary, I'm using the key terms to understand or to point back to the main idea, to reinforce that main idea. So kids utilize structural analysis by focusing on morphemes, so affixes, root words, to sound out and learn the meaning of multisyllabic words. Teaching structural analysis is essential for students' acquisition of complex vocabulary common in the upper grades. And so I would get more into detail what structural analysis is, but that's not the purpose for this video, even though it's fun for me to talk about. But essentially, my summary reinforces my main idea that structural analysis is essential. And then here I have a strategy or example that I would talk about more in detail during the test, especially if it's an open-ended test where I have to explain, which strategies I would use, and that ties in back to the structural analysis strategies objective that I had. I have my second main idea, again, the same structure with the key terms, and then a summary, which reinforces that main idea. And so this is really, really, really helpful if you learn like this, you really want to understand the main idea. So someone who needs to understand the main idea of something and then break everything down into its separate parts. And again, it's very helpful if this is how your tests are normally organized. To determine how a test is organized is very difficult, but sometimes you can kind of tell based on previous tests that the teacher has given, like how they organize it. And again, clarifying what the test is going to be about. So if your professor says the test is going to be about one specific source like C.S. Lewis, then that means it makes sense to more so organize your study guide according to chapters rather than question and answers. And so let's look at how to add in a table of contents. So essentially what you want to do is to highlight each main heading. So in this case, your main ideas, and then set them to heading 1. So they're going to change a little bit, which is perfectly fine. So you might want to move your definitions on a different line. So for example, morphemes, because it's a subheading, I'm going to set it to heading 2. Okay, but do you see how the definitions are set to heading 2 as well? I want to make sure that is not the case, so I want to keep it normal text by moving it down and then setting morphemes back to heading 2. So that way, only the main headings and the subheadings appear in the table of contents, and you'll see what I'm talking about by leaving structural analysis on the same line as its definition. So let's just do the different for the other key term. So this will be putting this downwards. Multisyllabic would be heading 2. Structural analysis, even if I highlight it on its own and make it heading 2, it's going to make the definition heading 2. But we'll keep it like that so we can learn how to change it.
So we're going to do the same thing here. Heading 1 for the main section. And you can always change it back to the formatting. I'm not going to do that for the purpose of this walkthrough. I'm just going to focus on putting these where they're supposed to be.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of create space for my table of contents by actually going to insert all the way down to page elements, and then it'll give me a side prompt. So I'm going to head into it and go to table of contents. So I want to add in hyperlinks so I can easily navigate through the document. So I will choose this last third option, and voila, you have your table of contents. So as you can see, I have everything that I want in here, but I want to update it because the definition for structural analysis, because I set it to heading level 2, it appeared in the table of contents, which I don't want. What I can do, I can just click on this, go back to structural analysis, and then I could put that on a separate line and just change this back to a normal text because only heading 1 and heading 2 will appear in the table of contents. So apply normal text, adjust as needed, and then when I go back, I have to click on the table to update it. And as you can see, structural analysis, the keyword or term is there, but not its definition. That is how you add an updated table of contents. And again, I could either use this block to navigate, or I could just use this little tab document option. Say if I want to go back to main idea 2, it'll take me to there. 3 queuing system. Yep, I have my term and then the definition right here. A controversial reading system which applies MSV queuing as an instructional strategy. If you'd like to read more about this, it's very interesting for me, especially as someone who wants to be a reading teacher. So I'll include the link below of the source where I got this information from. So it's from Reutzel and Cooter. And I actually added in specific page numbers so that way I can remember where I got this information from. So that's also really important when you are creating a study guide to put in page numbers in your sources so you remember which information you are using. It's very, very helpful, even if you don't have to cite for an open-ended essay or response. It's always good to be like, hey, I remember where this information is coming from. So that's also a good, helpful note. And again, you can do the same thing for Word, just setting the main and subheadings to their proper heading levels in the Styles tab, I believe, or whatever tab that Word has, and you can just create a table of contents that way and update it as well. Before we end our session, I just want to reinforce these 3 things. Number 1, paraphrase. You want to make sure that you can explain concepts in your own words. If you do that in your study guide, it's going to help prepare you to answer potential open-ended questions that are on the test, especially if it's a time test. Sometimes we get stumped with what to write or how to respond to a question. Well, if you practice responding to a question that most likely could be on the test based on the main ideas and key terms that you have learned throughout the course, because the test is going to assess you on what you've already learned, not on new material, hopefully. So you're able to prepare so that way you can answer efficiently and effectively. So practice paraphrasing. You also want to plan. Please do not create a study guide in a very short period of time because you want to be able to plan, organize it, and be able to put all of your sources, your annotations, your notes, anything that is most important together. So it requires planning. You also want to prepare and do not plan a great study guide and just review it once. You really want to implicitly learn as you're gathering information, putting it in together, but also explicitly to put in the work in to prepare for the exam and test multiple times as needed. And so, of course, you also want to have fun and be creative as well. I wanted to end with this wonderful quote. So, studying is the means by which we learn God's truth for ourselves and the hope of learning about ourselves through the Word of God. So, this is really encouraging and inspiring because it reminds us that studying isn't just intaking information, it's actually learning and comprehending worthwhile information that points back to the reality and truth of Jesus Christ. No matter what subjects we're learning, whether it's history, math, English, anything can point back to Him because He is reality, He is the truth. And so I hope that this encourages you to take an active role in your studying and to create a study guide to further help you not only to ace exams, but to appreciate the material that you've been learning in the course. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope this is helpful. I'll include helpful links in the description box below, so feel free to check them out. And I hope to see you guys again soon. Take care.